Good afternoon and welcome everybody. I'm Kathleen McCartney, the president of Smith College, and I am delighted to welcome you to this lecture and to introduce our speaker, the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and author and Smith alumna, Amy Ellis Nutt. Amy graduated from Smith in 1977 and was a double major in English and philosophy. She went on to earn a master's degree in philosophy from MIT and in journalism from Columbia University. In 2009, when Amy was working at the New Jersey Star-Ledger, she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for her series of stories about a man who became what she called an accidental artist. She later turned this series into a book called Shadows Bright as Glass. In 2011, Amy won a Pulitzer in feature writing for her investigation into the sinking of a scallop boat off the coast of Cape May, an accident that killed 6 of the 7 crew members aboard. Her next book, The Teenage Brain, which she co-authored with Smith alumna Frances Jensen from the class of '78, became a New York Times bestseller. Now a reporter for the Washington Post, Amy has received numerous other awards and fellowships, including the Smith Medal. Was that 2013-14 academic year? Yes. A Nieman Fellowship in Journalism at Harvard, the Sigma Delta Chi Award from the Society of Professional Journalists, and the Distinguished Writing Award from the American Society of Newspaper Editors. Last fall, Amy's latest book, Becoming Nicole, The Transformation of an American Family, was published. This New York Times bestseller tells the story of a couple accepting and eventually championing that one of their twin boys identifies as a transgender girl, and the book chronicles that courageous girl's fight to live an authentic life. In a recent interview with the Smith Alumni Quarterly, Amy said of the book, and I quote, "We are all more than our categories, more than our physical bodies, more than how the world sees us. Nicole is more than transgender. She's an actress. She's a comedian. She's an over-the-top, non-stop talker, and she's deeply loved. This book is first and foremost a love story." Amy also said, "I'm incredibly proud of Smith College for its transgender admission decision. The school did exactly the right thing when it said, if you identify as female, Smith is for you." The title of her talk today is Transformations, Writing and Understanding Transgender Lives. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished alum, Amy Ellis Nutt.
Thank you, Kathy, so much. Thank you, Chris Loring. Thank you, Smith College, for inviting me. I have to say, I always sound much more interesting when I listen to someone introduce me. Trust me, I'm not that interesting. But I like the way I sound. And I should also tell you, really, I'm Amy Nutt, but my byline is Amy Ellis Nutt only because my mother, 20 years ago, said when I moved from Amy Nutt byline at Sports Illustrated to the New York Star-Ledger, you know, Amy Nutt just looks too small in print. Really think you should put the middle name. No, my mother is 90 years old, and I still listen to her. So that is why I am Amy Ellis Nutt, which, you know, it sounds better. Again, thank you so much. It's wonderful to see people here. I want to give a shout out to one of my best friends from college, Kathy Bajors-House in the back row, John Connolly, my first philosophy professor, freshman year, fall 1973. Bless you for being here. I'm sorry the late Patricia Scarda, my advisor in English, who passed away last year, could not be here, but she is much remembered. So I'd like to begin by reading a few excerpts from early in the book, for those of you who are not familiar with the story. So this is actually how I begin the book. The child is mesmerized, tapping his toes and shuffling his small sandaled feet in a kind of awkward dance. He swirls and twirls, not in front of the camera, but in front of the window in the shiny black oven door. It's just the right height for a 2-year-old. Wyatt is bare-chested and wears a floppy hat on the back of his head. A string of colorful Mardi Gras beads swings around his neck. But what has really caught his attention, what has made this moment magical, are the shimmering sequins on his pink tutu. With every twist and turn, slivers of light briefly illuminate the face of the little boy, entranced by his own image. "This is one of Wyatt's favorite pastimes, dancing in front of the window of the stove," says the disembodied voice behind the video camera. "He's got his new skirt on and his bohemian chain and his hat, and he's going at it. Wave to the camera, Why." Maybe Wyatt doesn't hear his father. Maybe he's only half listening, but for whatever reason, he ignores him, and instead sways back and forth, his eyes never leaving his own twinkling reflection. Finally, the little boy does what he's asked, sort of. He twists his head around slightly and gazes shyly up at his father, then lets out a small squeal of delight. It is a child's expression of intense happiness, but Wayne Maines wants something else. "Show me your muscles, Why? Can I see your muscles?" he prompts the son. Suddenly, Wyatt seems self-conscious. His eyes slide slowly from his father's face and settle on something or nothing on the other side of the kitchen, just out of camera range. He hesitates, not sure what to do, then, ignoring his father again, turns back to the oven window and strikes a pose. It's a half-hearted pose, really. With his two little fists propped under his chin, he flexes his non-existent muscles. He knows he's not giving his father what he wants, but he also can't seem to break the spell of his reflection. "Show me your muscles. Over here. Show them to me." Wayne is getting frustrated. "Show Daddy your muscles, like this, over here. Wyatt, show me your muscles." At last, the appeals have their desired effect. Wyatt turns again toward his father, hand still under his chin, arm still against his sides, and looks up at him. But that's it. That's all Wayne Maines is going to get. With a look of part defiance, part apology, the little boy turns back to the oven window. "All right, that's enough," the disappointed father says, and clicks the camera off. Before love, before loss, before we ever yearn to be something we are not, we are bodies breathing in space. Turbulent, fleshy, sensual, Walt Whitman once wrote. We are inescapably physical, drawn to the inescapably human. But if we are defined by our own bodies, we are entwined by the bodies of others. An upright, moving human being is endlessly more fascinating to an infant than any rattle or plaything. At 6 months, babies can barely babble, but they can tell the difference between a male and a female. When a feverish infant rests its head on its mother's chest, her body cools to compensate and brings the child's temperature down. Place the ear of a preemie against his mother's heart, and the baby's irregular heartbeat finds its right rhythm. As we grow and mature and become self-conscious, we are taught that appearances, who we are on the outside, are nearly as important as who we are on the inside. And yet, beauty beguiles us. Human beings are unconsciously drawn to the symmetrical and the aesthetic. We are, in short, uncompromisingly physical, even self-absorbed. The philosopher and psychologist William James once wrote that man's most palpable selfishness is bodily selfishness, and his most palpable self is the body. But man does not love his body because he identifies himself with it. Rather, as James said, he identifies himself with his body because he loves it. And if he does not love his body, what then? How can you occupy a physical space, be a body in space, and yet be alienated from it at the same time? We are all born with traits, characteristics, and physical markers that allow others to identify us, to say he's a boy or she's a girl, but of our who-ness or whatness, our essence. There is no single place in the brain, no clump of gray matter, no nexus of electrical activity we can point to and say, aha, here it is. Here is myself. Here is my soul. All those questions about who and what we are, they were still in the future when Wayne and Kelly first brought their boys home from the hospital. Unable to have biological children, the parents looked on their identical twin sons as wholly unexpected gifts. Wayne, in particular, yearned for the day when he could buy his boys their first hunting rifles, their first fishing rods, their first baseball gloves. That was the way it had always been done in his family, and that was how he would continue the tradition. Who we are is inseparable, not only from who we think we are, but from who others think we are. We are touched and loved, we are appreciated or dismissed, praised or scorned, comforted or wounded. But before all else, we are seen. We are identified by others through the contours and colors and movements of our bodies. In his 1903 treatise, The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois, the African-American author and intellectual, wrote about a double consciousness, a two-ness of the Negro race. Quote, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, unquote. Dignity, self-respect, the right to be treated as an equal, it's what everyone wants. But Du Bois knew that those who are alienated from the community of man because of color, or one might add because of sexual orientation or gender identity, have a much harder path, because the alienated, the differentiated, the misfits of society must bear the burden of a single unspoken question on the lips of even the most polite members of society. What does it feel like to be a problem? 4 years ago, when it became clear that I had the opportunity to tell the story of the Maines family, I was fascinated and excited. I'd read the story December 2011 in the Boston Globe, but I was also skeptical. This was before Caitlyn Jenner. It was before Laverne Cox appeared on the cover of Time magazine beside the headline, The Transgender Tipping Point, America's Next Civil Rights Frontier, and boy, weren't they prescient. So I asked my agent, do you think anyone is going to want to read a book about a transgender twin? That's how much things have changed in 4 years. The book is selling well. It's coming out in paperback in June. How much things have changed in 40 years, and it really pains me to say that because that's nearly when I graduated. When I took the first Psychology of Sex Roles course at Smith in the spring of my senior year, one of the books that we read that semester was Combat in the Erogenous Zone by 28-year-old Ingrid Bengus, published in 1972. It had the provocative subtitle, A Shattering Exploration of Love, Hate, and Sex. What was so shattering was clear in the New York Times review, which said the author wrote, quote, with fierce, almost embarrassing honesty about the war between the sexes. That's where the culture wars were in the 1970s. During the second wave of feminism, it was men versus women. It was the masculine patriarchy versus the feminine slave class. One of the biggest political events of my 4 years at Smith, and I use the word political lightly, since this was also the time many college students, including Smith students, demanded institutions divest from apartheid South Africa, was a tennis match between 29-year-old women's pro, Billie Jean King, and 55-year-old former pro, Bobby Riggs, dubbed the Battle of the Sexes. It took place in the Houston Astrodome in front of 30,000 people, the largest amount of people at that time to witness a tennis match. Another 90 million people around the world watched while Billie Jean King handily defeated Bobby Riggs in straight sets. The match was held at night, and afterward, spontaneously, Smith students poured out of their houses and spontaneously marched around campus. Someone even hung a huge banner outside Martha King, briefly changing its name to Billie Jean King House. And there's photographic evidence. It hung up there for days afterwards. In reflecting on it, these were rather naive times in terms of feminism. They were downright dark times in terms of transgender issues, a word that really didn't exist in the vocabulary at that point. In a 1977 academic study in the Journal of Archives of Sexual Behavior, this was the same time that I was taking the Psychology of Sex Roles, in which Dr. John Money from Johns Hopkins was considered the guru, and we can talk about that afterwards if you want to know more about John Money. This was a study done by researchers at Brown University and the University of Tennessee Medical School, describing a surprisingly effective, albeit unusual treatment, quote, for the relief of suffering in a transsexual. This was not something the two scientists had performed on the patient, but rather they were aware of this patient and sort of tracked him through this, I suppose one would call it experiment. The supposed importance of the research and why they were writing about it rested on the fact that it presented a kind of model of behavioral conditioning as an alternative to sex reassignment surgery, which the scientists described as, quote, this radical and irreversible treatment for what is basically a psychological problem. They even provided graphs of feminine versus masculine motor behavior before and after treatment. So what was this therapeutic intervention that apparently led a transgender woman, a woman who was about to undergo sex reassignment surgery, to instead accept being born with the sexual anatomy of a male? It was an exorcism. In their conclusion, the researchers wrote, obviously, this case has little relevance for therapeutic intervention at this time, since most transsexuals are unlikely to flock to the nearest faith healer. Wasn't that an understatement? But the fact that it did occur could extend the study of the effects of social influence variables to what has been the most intractable of all psychiatric disorders, to determine if it is possible to develop psychological intervention to replace surgical treatment in at least some cases. The front lines of feminism at the time were no less forgiving, as in this excerpt from a 1983 book. Transsexuals are paying an extreme tribute to the power of sex roles. In order to set their real human personalities free, they surgically mutilate their own bodies. Instead of serving more life-saving but often less lucrative needs for their surgical and hormone therapy skills, some physicians are aiding individuals who are desperately trying to conform to an unjust society. The book was Outrageous Acts and Everyday Rebellions, and the author was Gloria Steinem. 6 years earlier, she more succinctly asked, if the shoe doesn't fit, must we change the foot? To her great good credit, Steinem apologized for those beliefs and those words 30 years later, saying that that last question was in response to stories she'd heard about gays and lesbians undergoing sex changes as a way to avoid hostility because of society's bias against their sexual orientation, already a confusion between sexual orientation and gender identity. In the October 2013 issue of The Advocate, Steinem wrote, "So now I want to be unequivocal in my words. I believe that transgender people, including those who have transitioned, are living out real, authentic lives. Those lives should be celebrated, not questioned. Their healthcare decisions should be theirs and theirs alone to make. And what I wrote decades ago does not reflect what we know today, as we move away from the only binary boxes of masculine or feminine and begin to live along the full human continuum of identity expression." I learned what living along the full continuum really meant when I met the Maines family. Nicole and her brother Jonas and their parents, Kelly and Wayne, were about as ordinary a middle-class family as you can get. They look like you and me, your colleagues, your neighbors, your sisters, your brothers, your friends, your family. They are, in fact, ordinary, but each of them extraordinary in their own way. Nicole, incredibly secure, self-aware, open, honest. Jonas, sensitive, supportive, wise. Kelly, a mother determined simply to see her children safe and happy. Wayne, a conservative, a hunter, the product of small-town values, who had to learn not how to love his child, not how to protect her, but how to embrace and understand her. I had the privilege of watching the twins move through 4 years of high school and graduate last June, of watching them grow into themselves, body and mind. I watched the family lose, then win court cases, lose and win friends, lose hope, and win it back again. I also learned a tremendous amount from simply reporting and writing this book. I'd met transgender people, but I knew little about the science, the history, the culture. In fact, when I read for the first time the words gender spectrum, I thought naively, well, that's a lovely metaphor. It didn't take me long to realize that it's not a metaphor at all. It is a medical and scientific reality. Gender identity, like sexual anatomy and sexual orientation, is a function of the brain and the result of brain processes that take place largely before a baby is even born. As developmental processes, sexual anatomy, gender identity, sexual orientation occur at different times in the developing brain of a fetus and are enormously complex. Because of this, they can be affected by myriad circumstances, including everything from what a mother feels and experiences to what she eats, drinks, and breathes. When you consider the number of possible permutations, I suggest it approaches infinity. You think of it this way. There are 10 trillion cells in the human body. Each cell contains billions of base pairs of DNA. and tens of thousands of distinct protein-coding genes. Then there are millions of proteins that attach themselves to those genes that either turn them on or turn them off. That on-off pattern helps determine everything from our propensity to anger to our vulnerability to cancer, to what sex we identify with and what sex we're attracted to. And that doesn't even bring in hormones yet. This is the burgeoning science of transgender, of sex, and it's not confirmed science. There's much still to be learned, but it's the beginning of what we know. What we do know is that no one thing apparently determines either sex or gender. 1 in 100 babies are born with some differences in their genitalia from average. 1 in 200 is born with atypical genitalia. Sexual anatomy, in other words, is not a fixed target, nor is gender identity. And it isn't in nature. Moray eels and gobies change sex. When the top female clownfish dies, the dominant male switches sex. When the sole male in a school of reef fish dies, the largest female gets aggressive and begins to produce sperm. A very recent study comparing brain anatomy of males and females found that the majority of brains researchers looked at were a mosaic of male and female structures. Between a quarter to a half of all the brains contained a mix of regions that fell on the male end and female end of the spectrum. There are just a few structures in the brain that appear to have substantial differences, numbers of gray matter and white matter between men and women. But very few of these brains they looked at, between 0 and 8%, contained either all male structures or all female structures. All of which is to say, it's absurd to think we are all born either 100% male or 100% female. It's illogical as well as being untrue. We are all more than the names or labels we give ourselves or the categories institutions assign us to. If the essential conflict in life is the individual's search to know the self, the fierceness of that search is matched by society's need to categorize, describe, classify, and arrange. Society, as if we don't know by now, favors, encourages conformity. But nature favors diversity. Transgender isn't an aberration, it's a variation. Gender is indeed a spectrum. And how could it be otherwise? The essayist Rebecca Solnit once wrote, "We think we tell stories, but often stories tell us. Tell us to love or to hate, to see or to be blind. The strange life of books and of a writer is that you enter alone, mapping an unknown territory that arises as you travel. If you succeed in the voyage, others enter after, one at a time, also alone, but in communion with your imagination, traversing your route. Books are solitudes in which we meet, and a story is a thread that meanders through our lives to connect us each to each and to the purpose and meaning that appear like roads we must travel." These words have come back to me again and again since this book was published last October. I've heard from many people, young and old, transgender and cisgender, gay and straight. Perhaps none has moved me quite as much as this email from a man in New Zealand, the owner of his own tech company, which I checked online to make sure it was really true. I'm a reporter after all. This is what he wrote. "I've just finished reading the book, and I would like to tell you that it has made a big difference in the life of at least one person, and that's me. Having grown up in what one might call a more traditional environment, highly influenced by a Christian worldview, my convictions were along the binary view that there are males and females and nothing in between. Your book has tremendously helped me by challenging my opinions, or let me call them stereotypes or even prejudice. I can say that after reading your book, I have adopted a very different perspective on this topic. And I'm glad you did challenge me through your book. The thought process it triggered came at the right time. Yesterday, I interviewed a candidate for an opening in my company. He mentioned in his CV that he is an active member of the LGBT community. In the past, I would have stumbled on that. Not anymore. I hired him. I hired him purely for who he is as a human being, and for the talents that I'm convinced he will bring to the team. This also shows the ripple effect that your book has, even beyond your home country. Thank you so much for writing up the story of the Maines family. Should they, or one of them, ever be in this part of the world, they are welcome to contact me. My family and I would be honored to have them as guests in our home. Language matters. On November 21st, 1966, a small single-column story appeared at the bottom of page 1 of the New York Times. And it began, "The Johns Hopkins Hospital has quietly begun performing sex change surgery." Startling, momentous, but the use of the word quietly tells us so much more. It tells us about embarrassment or shame or fear, things that in time Johns Hopkins would have to renege on, their gender clinic, another story we could get into. It was clear in the middle of the story where things were at that time, even in 1966. And this is 3 years after Harry Benjamin's book. Psychiatrists believe that transsexualism is caused by prolonged conditioning early in life, perhaps within the first 3 years. Some cases in which a mother wanted a daughter instead of a son and raised her child accordingly seem obvious, but the origins of others is obscure. Indeed. It takes science to lift things out of obscurity, but sometimes it does take stories like Nicole and her family to shine a light on the truth. Nicole summed it up for me a couple of years ago. She said, "Stories move the walls that need to be moved." And she's right. Words can burn down or they can build. They can be razor-edged and merciless, or they can be capacious and forgiving. They can obscure the truth or they can unearth it. A book or a story is just a tool to tell a life. It is a hammer, an axe, a shovel, and we write and read our way to answers. Which is why you and I, in whatever way we can, must keep telling stories, must keep moving minds and hearts and, yes, walls with whatever tools we have. Calvin Hurton, the late poet, essayist, and professor of American Studies at Oberlin, said it this way in his poem, The Distant Drum. "I am not a metaphor or symbol. This you hear is not the wind in the trees, nor a cat being maimed in the street. I am being maimed in the street. It is I who weep, laugh, feel pain or joy. Speak this, because I exist. This is my voice. These words are my words. My mouth speaks them. My hand writes. I am a poet. It is my fist you hear beating against your ear. To be a person is to be a story, to be a narrative, a life history that is continually unfolding, that is never finished. The challenge each of us faces is to find the center of our own narrative gravity. One of the epigrams in the book is from Marcel Proust's Time Regained, and it's fundamentally about how the search to uncover truth is our deepest meaning, and how those hard-earned truths define who we are. He said, in French, I can't translate, "What we have not had to decipher, to elucidate by our own efforts. What was clear before we looked at it is not ours. From ourselves comes only that which we drag forth from obscurity which lies within us, that which to others is unknown." That is the challenge. That's the challenge I want to leave you with. Identify your own mysteries and master them, and then share them. As the poet Honor Moore once wrote, "We don't choose our stories choose us. And if we don't tell them, we are somehow diminished." Thank you. So, please, questions, criticism, comments. And I'll call on you if you do not raise your hand. President McCartney.
course, about Nicole's journey is that she's an identical twin.
Yeah.
And so her identical twin is cis male. And you alluded a little bit to the complexity of the body as a biological organism. But can you say more about what you've learned about potential epigenetic factors?
Yeah.
And also, I think as a psychologist, I'm even more interested in this sibling relationship.
Yeah. Thank you. It's a great question. And I do get into more of epigenetics, which, if you haven't declared your major, I don't know if you can major in epigenetics, but man, it's a fascinating field. You know, it's that huge gray area between nature and nurture. And yes, part of the attraction of doing this book was very much because they were identical twins. And people have said to me, well, my God, they have the exact same DNA. How could they possibly be different, be different genders? We were talking about this last night over dinner, Julio and Professor Whittier and Anna Houston. What I've learned is that so much of who we are and who we become has to do with these epigenetic factors in the womb. Look, identical twins are certainly not purely identical. They die from different diseases, they have different personalities. Obviously, they look exactly the same, and much is the same, but they're affected in the world by their environment. They're affected by the environment in the womb. And what's affected by the environment in the womb are those molecular switches that turn on and off. So their DNA looks exactly alike, but their epigenome, which switches are on, which switches are off, can be completely different. So Jonas and Nicole, the whole family is a great example of gender stereotypes turned on their head. Wayne, this stalwart Air Force veteran, Republican, conservative, he's no longer Republican. Obvious reasons. This man will cry at the drop of a hat. It's really embarrassing doing interviews with him because I know, Wayne, don't cry because then he's going to make me cry, and, we start to cry. And so if you listen to any of the interviews we've done, it's Wayne's voice that starts to crack first. And God bless him. Kelly is this incredibly grounded, stalwart, not emotional. I'm not actually sure in the 4 years that I've, known them, I've actually ever seen Kelly cry. She is, to me, the hero of this book, because without her, Nicole, the family would not be where they are, and certainly Nicole wouldn't, although this kid came out of the womb self-confident, probably shouting something. And Nicole, who is this alpha female, fully admits, as I say in the book, that Jonas is much more sensitive than she is. She's really competitive. She loves, I watched hours of her doing violent video games and blowing up and maiming people like you wouldn't believe. And, it's just, she loves it. Jonas writes poetry, plays the guitar. He's a really good-looking kid. He's very heterosexual. God bless him, because he's gotten in trouble with several girlfriends his freshman year in college because they both found out he was dating them at the same time. So everything about this family. So these are identical twins, and they don't have close to the same personality. Their voices are slightly different. Their height is now different, obviously. They talk almost exactly the same. Their expressions are exactly the same. You can see the identicalness in them. Nicole loves seeing Jonas because now she also sees how handsome she would have been if she was still a boy. So she's very vain that way. And, Jonas is too a little bit. But the attraction to this book was delineating as best I could and talking to scientists to explain how it is that you can have the same identical DNA and be entirely different, including your gender identity. And, I learned that even your position in the womb, whether it's twins or wherever you are in the womb, but especially if you're twins, you can get different amounts of hormones, these separate umbilical cords from the mother. You're getting different chemical signals. So your brain is actively being organized. It's being organized differently. All these subtle things make a difference. Our sexual anatomy, they believe, well, they know, is set by 6 weeks. They believe gender identity, your brain is not masculinized or feminized until 6 months. That's a lot of time for a lot of things and a lot of influences from the environment. This is all in utero, from the environment in the womb to change things. So when you understand, and I'm a dilettante in understanding the science, but when you understand it a little bit, it seems, yeah, that makes sense. How could gender not be a spectrum? Sexual anatomy is a spectrum too, and that's what we're learning. So that was a long answer, but you are the president of the college, so you get the longest answer. Yes?
So during the speech you talked about how gender is something that is a result of certain chemicals in the brain before you're born and it's set. But then you also just said that it's not set until 6 months, and then also I wonder if it's so genetic, how do you reconcile that with the fact that we have a lot of people on Smith's campus who identify as many different genders throughout the 4 years and before? So it's a spectrum and it's fluid, but I also got the sense that it's like set biologically.
Yeah, that's a great question. And when I was referring to 6 months and 6 weeks, I was talking about in utero. But clearly, I mean, we also know that one of the biggest production of testosterone happens in utero, and then the second biggest before puberty happens in the first few weeks right after birth. So your brain is still being formed after birth. What we know, the teenage brain, for instance, we know isn't fully wired until late in your 20s. Your prefrontal cortices are still undergoing a little bit of, it's why being a teenager is so fabulous, because, your neurons are firing, give me information, I want to learn, but they're being pruned back, so, use it or lose it. And you're not, your myelin isn't being fully connected to your prefrontal cortex until, you're well into your 20s. So environment is everything. I mean, it's not everything, duh. But it's really, really important. So yes, there are certain things that influence directions that you take or impulses that you have, and then there's society around you. And there are people telling you things, or there is learning that there is an avenue for you, or that there's an openness. I mean, people put themselves into categories because that was what they were supposed to do. And the beauty of your generation today is understanding that we're not boxes, and that so many things, that it's not just nature or nurture, it's nature and nurture, and all of those things in between, all of those things in the environment, not just the people you talk to, but the things you eat, drink, and breathe, that can change you. It's a really, really complex phenomenon, but it's also why it's incumbent upon us to be open, and to be open to people discovering, I'm really neither, so I really just want to be who I am, and which again is why language is so important. Language can constrict us and it can free us, and often it's trying to do it at the same time. Language in some ways is just a shorthand, I'm LGBTQI, and so I can tell, hey, I'm the I in LGBTQI, or I'm the B, and that's shorthand for us to talk and identify with one another, but it's not who we are, right?
So do you believe that there's a gendered brain then?
A gendered brain? No, I think there's gender in the brain, but it's not male and it's not female. It's male tendencies or female tendencies, or maybe we shouldn't even be using those words because that traps us. Sort of like we don't want to go back to the 70s, the battle of the sexes. We know so much more than that. But teasing out the influence of genes, of hormones, of environment, and not just the environment that we live and breathe in, but the environment of a womb, that's up to the scientists, But you're right, they're not going to tell us everything. They're going to tell us a little bit, and we have to understand that the truth also lies within us. That, maybe my birth and my mother had a certain amount of hormones. I mean, look, my mother takes pride in saying when she was wheeled in the hospital wheeled into the, to get to the delivery room. She got up on one elbow, took a puff of her cigarette, and put it out. And it is wrong on so many levels, right? On so many levels. And she's really proud. She says, look how you turned out. I go, yeah, well, we could argue about some things. We could. Now people have said, I'm a lesbian. People have said mothers who smoke maybe increases the risk of a daughter being gay. Who the hell knows? Do I really care? No. My mother said, when I told her that, I said, I don't know about that, So, it's important to some level that we figure some of these things out. It's also important that we take them all in context. That was a very long answer to your question, too. So maybe you are the next president of Smith College. Sorry, I'll try and be shorter. Yes?
I really enjoyed your book, and I thought that there were a lot of sort of poignant moments and intelligent things that people said, especially Kelly and especially Nicole. And I was just curious sort of how much of that came out of your interactions and interviews with them, and how much of it was written down. In particular, Kelly says something that stuck with me, which is when she was arguing about like whether she had affected Nicole, and she says like, are all men just one doll away from being women?
Right.
I sort of wondered where that came from, and then Nicole had a really powerful piece too, right before she underwent surgery about like doing this for Wyatt, and I just was curious about those two.
Yeah, the first one, in which Kelly really said, so fucking bullshit. And then she did say that. That was she repeated that to me often because it really stuck with her. Almost everything that comes in terms of current dialogue or things that they said comes directly from Wayne and Kelly and from them agreeing that certain things were said. Nicole, I'd actually asked her, sometimes it was easier to get her, to write to me, and most of it was, direct face-to-face, or it was talking on the phone. But I wanted her, I knew the importance of sometimes just stopping and thinking about things and writing things down. I once did this with a class, actually at Princeton, and I gave them all fountain pens. They had no idea what that was. Some of them really didn't know how to hold it, but I wanted them to write, and it was revelatory because they took their time and they really thought about it, and they could see things that they scratched out. So I knew the value of having Nicole just sort of write to me, and that was, what she sort of wrote to me. And, when I read it, it was like, oh, it was beautiful. Look, I've said this to many people. I said it last night. I said it today. If a book could have written itself, this book could have. And really, it was a combination of things. Wayne was an archivist par excellence. He saved everything. They had a court case, so I had all of the medical histories. I had therapy notes. I talked to therapists, but I had all the notes that were done, when she was growing up. So I had all that every piece of artwork, and obviously hundreds of hours of video. And people who have had their first children, I haven't, but hey, there's still hope. Know that you take video of everything because you just never know, right? It's all fascinating. So it was a lot of really, really boring stuff. A lot of stuff was around bath time. It was fascinating. I could really see what was going on in this child's mind, the way he behaved. So, and there was a natural arc to this story. I was writing furiously since she had her, gender affirmation surgery just, in July, and the book came out in October, so I had to have everything done. But, it's also a writer's dream when you have not one, not two, but four people who are not only self-reflective but can talk about it. And not only remember important things in their lives, but are able, again, to reflect on it and be insightful. And so it was a writer's, I didn't have to occasionally with the twins. Look, Jonas, who is just a remarkable, I call him a child, but he's not. He said to me a few years ago, when someone asked him, it was one of my favorite parts of the book, I asked him, I said, what was it like when people kept asking you about your sister and everything? And he said, sometimes they approach me because I'm a lot more approachable than Nicole, who's alpha and out there. And he said, but imagine what it's like when someone's asking you these questions and all you have is a 6th